Hello, folks. I've got a question for you. Have you noticed that the strata of celebrity or virality has recently been sort of dominated by complete and utter stupidity? This is something that I've seen a lot of people, both online and in reality, start to notice and complain about a lot, which is that people who do stupid or silly things are quickly sort of barraged into the limelight and catapulted into wealth and fame and all these other things that people typically desire, despite the fact that they've not really done anything seemingly to deserve it. And it seems kind of like a bit of an unusual sociological mystery. Like, why is it that society is making stupid people, or perhaps more accurately, people who do stupid things, famous? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why America keeps making stupid people famous. Now, here's the thing, though. This is not necessarily a problem with exclusively the United States. It's more so that America is by far the richest, most powerful, and most influential country in the Western sphere. More importantly than that, though, it speaks English. That's a big deal because English is, of course, the status quo language of the Western world. If you don't speak it as a primary language, you're going to speak it as a secondary language. I mean, obviously, or you wouldn't be watching this, you wouldn't be able to understand what I'm saying. And those combinations make America much more relevant across the Western world. Things that happen in Germany, in France, or even in the UK, which obviously also speaks English, because of their size or language constraints, things tend to stay in their national borders. With America, it penetrates its national borders, it spreads its ways and its culture around the world, and so it's a lot more noticeable and a lot more dominant, I would say. So it's not so much a problem with America; it's a global problem. But America is definitely at the heart of this problem. So we're going to start off with number one, the four horsewomen. I feel like the vast majority of people watching this will know what I mean by America keeps making stupid people famous, but for those who don't know, I want to provide four concrete, solid examples of people who have done something silly or bizarre or strange, and as a result of that, have been rewarded with fame and wealth and whatnot, beyond what would be considered normal or even expected. Like, not the sort of outcome that you could even predict logically. But I'm going to warn you, however, this will be utterly absurd, obscene, and, well, pretty stupid. And, I got to say, I don't usually like talking about individuals. I usually feel like it's rude or it's wrong or whatever, but I can't really explain this phenomenon if I don't give you some examples, right? So whether I like it or not, I have to. So we're going to start off with number one, all right? And we're going to start off with the Cash Me Outside girl. Okay, so the reason for that this woman got fame was because she was rude to the audience on the Dr. Phil show, right? So she was on a show in America called Dr. Phil, and she was getting angry with the audience and fed up with the audience, and she said to the audience, almost threatening them, like, "Cash me outside, how about that?" Something like that. I don't know what that means, but I assume it's a threat of sorts, or some sort of, I don't know, taunt, I don't know. And, for some reason, this moment, and I'm not going to show you this moment or any other moments because I think they're a waste of time, and you've probably seen them anyway. And I don't want to be forced to watch them again, to be completely honest with you. But this moment, which seems, the way that I've explained it, it seems relatively tame, quite boring, not that much of a big deal. People have tantrums and taunts and arguments all the time. For some reason, people loved this moment. They thought it was the funniest thing in the world. And the outcome of that was that she eventually became a millionaire via a lucrative rap career, right? And, you've got to take a look at some of these songs. She made great songs such as These Hooks, Hi Bish, What You Know, I Got It, Mama Don't Worry, Still Ain't Dirty, Both of M, and of course, who can forget, the masterpiece, Gucci Flip Flops featuring Little Yorty, right? And some of these songs got gold and even platinum certifications. Okay, they're on the American charts, they're on the Canadian charts, right? These aren't like some sort of songs that are on SoundCloud and 5 people have heard them. No, these songs generate cash and attention. But to go back to the original point, the reason why she got this lucrative rap career was because of the original moment, right? The reason why she entered the public sphere, which was that she was rude to the audience on the Dr. Phil show. If that event didn't happen, which again seems insignificant in isolation, then the millionaire rap career also wouldn't have happened, right? So do you understand what I mean? This is a good example of like, why is someone being rewarded for bad behavior, right? Number 2, we have that MF is not real woman, okay? This was a woman who seemingly had some sort of delusional mental breakdown on a plane. In the clip, she's pointing at some passenger on a plane, and she's yelling that he's not real, right? And she looks genuinely concerned and freaked out, and she's clearly having some sort of mental breakdown. Like it's not normal behavior. As a consequence of this, she gained hundreds of thousands of followers online, alongside numerous business opportunities. I think she was selling beer or something like that. I don't know. But the point is that this firstly, there's an argument to be made this woman shouldn't have been filmed in the first place. But the point is that she's done something that's negatively affected herself, but also affected those around her. And it's not really that significant either. It's not like this. It's interesting, but it's not like mind-blowing. I mean, people do this sort of stuff all the time. But as a consequence of this, her fame, her notoriety, her wealth skyrocketed, again, beyond anything that probably herself, but also society could ever guess, right? That's another example. The third example is the N-word woman. Okay, now this is a woman who said the N-word online, I assume on some clips like TikTok or Twitter or something like that, some sort of social media. And she was hounded for it and refused to concede, right? So in America, the N-word in America has complicated racial controversies and dynamics. The N-word in the United States is kind of like, it's treated like a magic spell in a way. It's kind of like, in Harry Potter, when people say Voldemort, and then people would go, no, don't say Voldemort. Like, it's he who should not be named, right? It's like a forbidden word that you can't say, and if you say it, it has this stark effect on people. America is like this, where, some races in America can say the N-word, and it's considered like normal, right? It's viewed as like a comma almost. But if other races say it, then they should be put in jail, and they should be, just lose their job and everything. But even though it's just a word, and again, I understand there's historical reasons for this controversy, blah, blah, blah. But from the outside looking in, it's absurd. If a word is bad, then no one should say it. If a word is considered acceptable, then everyone should be allowed to say it with no consequences. You can't have these different rules for different people, irregardless of the historical, the history behind it. But either way, that's not the point. The point is that this woman, said this word. She was hounded for it, refused to concede. I think that she should have refused to concede. But again, that's not the point. The consequences of this were she gained hundreds of thousands of followers online, alongside a short-lived entry into conservative media. What I mean by this is that the progressives despised her and went after her negatively, so she gained infamy. The conservatives, some conservatives, started to put her on a pedestal and say, oh yeah, she's a free speech warrior, and giving her interviews and all these kinds of things, right? So, but again, regardless of your position on political correctness, freedom of speech, whatever your position is on that, the point is that this woman gained notoriety from saying the N-word. For like, whether you agree with it or not, that's the root origin. That's what caused this mass amount of attention. Okay? So again, it's a silly reason. It's a silly origin. And number 4, and this is the one that inspired me to start talking about this. The hawk chewer girl. Okay, right. So this was a woman who was with her friend, and she was given an amateur street interview where she talked about spitting on male genitalia. That's it, right? So she was asked a question, and she's like something like, "How do you impress a man?" or something like that, and she says like, "Oh, you've got to spit on their genitalia," like the spitting noise, hawk chewer. You know what I mean? God, I hate talking about this stuff. But anyway, the consequences of that, which again seem irrelevant, doesn't seem like a big deal, doesn't seem like something that would be noteworthy in any way, shape, or form. The consequences of this is that she gained millions of followers online, millions. And she had numerous business opportunities, companies paying her tens of thousands of dollars to turn up at certain events or be, going to concerts and being like celebrated, these kinds of things. And again, it's like the overall point of this is that I want you to try and imagine the most talented person you know personally, right? Whether it be a friend, a family member, someone who is either, I don't know, a musician, an artist, maybe it's you, I don't know, or a game developer, whatever, like a chef, someone who is really talented, really good at what they do, right? And then think for a moment how all of these examples that I've given here, who have done something less talented than whoever it is that you're thinking of has done, they've received more money and more fame, more notoriety, more everything from these strange and unusual, silly things that they've done than the talented person who you know, right? And so that's a mystery, right? So why is that the case is the point we're trying to get here, because that doesn't make sense, right? In normal societies, if people did these things, they would not be made millionaires. They would not be given celebrity. So what's going on, right? Why does America keep making stupid people, but stupid people is a bit harsh. It's more accurate to say people who do stupid things. Why does America keep making people who do stupid things famous, right? So now that I've given you the examples, let's go into what I think are the reasons why. And I think, by the way, there's two minuscule reasons, right? Two reasons that I think aren't quite as relevant. They're a big deal, but the last reason I think is much bigger and the real problem here that's at hand. And so let's go through these reasons, right? Let's talk about why. So let's start with number 2, the Springer effect. So back in the 1990s, there was this show called The Jerry Springer Show, and some of you who grew up in the 1990s and 2000s, you might remember this show very well, because it was at one point one of the hottest, if not the hottest shows in America. Everyone couldn't stop talking about it. Everyone couldn't stop watching it. All right, and the premise of the show, for those who don't know, was it was essentially they would find people who were angry or kind of people who were a bit shameless, people who lived in poverty usually, people who weren't the sharpest tools in the shed, and they would put them on stage and watch them fight, right? And they would usually fight because someone was cheating on someone else, or I don't know, someone's offspring wasn't who they thought it would be, or just the most ridiculous reasons ever, like people airing their dirty laundry in public in front of a merciless crowd who would laugh at them, jeer at them, make fun of them, and this was one of the biggest shows in the United States at the time. The Jerry Springer Show was actually so big that it either propped up other shows like it, or it even inspired or even created completely new shows. Like, for example, Maury was another one, which I actually think came out just before Springer, that not a lot of people know. But Maury was much more like, paternity tests, right? The whole "you are not the father" meme came from there, if you know that. Oh, Steve Wilkos, God, this one was terrible. Steve Wilkos was like a security guard of Springer, and they gave him his own show for some reason. And, gosh, whereas at least Springer and Maury were nice to their guests, but Wilkos was so rude. You can see him there, like, yelling in the faces of their guests, and he would do this thing where he would throw chairs around. Like, the guy was a total lunatic, and the idea that this guy was given his own show where he's meant to be the mediator is nothing short of comical. But Steve Wilkos is definitely one of my least favorite people in the media. If you've ever seen the show, you'll know what I mean. The weird thing is, he was only rude to the men. He was never rude to the women. I guess because it doesn't look good if a muscular bald guy is yelling in the faces of women, but with the men he would just rip them apart. It's the weirdest. It's like a very weird show. And of course, it's not just America. In the UK, you had Jeremy Kyle, right? I have no doubt that Jeremy Kyle was inspired by Jerry Springer, where they would find the poorest people in the UK, people from council estates, right? People with bad teeth or looked bizarre. And then they would, bring them on and they would fight and there'd be security, etc., right? So, all these shows were a big deal in the 1990s and the 2000s and even beyond. But Jerry Springer was the main show, right? Springer was like the one that really got all the focus, and people used to think it was fake because it was so ridiculous. It wasn't fake; it was real. But people thought it was like WWE. They couldn't believe that this was a real show. But the question is then, why was Jerry Springer so popular and shows like it? And this is because of what I call the Springer effect. And the Springer effect is where people watch something lowly, obscene, absurd, or some sort of combination of the three that both draws them in, not just via its rarity as a vista, but also the fact it makes them feel better about their own lives in comparison. Now that's quite a mouthful, let's break that down. The first part of it is the human circus, because these shows were like a human circus. They would bring people in who were clearly not in the right state of mind and basically humiliate them, voluntarily humiliate them, but still humiliate them on television for entertainment. Maybe they would get some assistance, but let's be honest, this is a show for entertainment for the audience in the studio and for the people at home. That's why people would tune in. People didn't tune in because they wanted to see people get help. They wanted to tune in to watch people fight and break down and go crazy. And so, when you see vistas, like scenes that are rare, you can't help but look away because they're so rare. And it doesn't mean that you approve of what's being seen. It just means that you can't look away. For example, a few days ago, at the time of recording, the ex-US President Donald Trump had an assassination attempt on his life, right? Now, obviously that's a terrible thing. And I don't think anyone watching this approves of assassinations, right? But almost everyone has seen the video of the assassin trying to do it. And it's not because people want to see it. It's because it's one of those events where it's so rare and it's so crazy. You can't not watch it. You can't look away from it. That's the point of the human circus. It's not that you necessarily approve of what you're watching. It's that it's so crazy. It's so ridiculous. It's so rare that you can't look away, right? You can't look away. That's one part of it, but the other part of it is that it pleases the crowds. And I don't mean it makes them happy. It makes the crowds feel superior to the people they're watching. They feel like, for example, you could be obese, you could have no partner, you could have no money, you could you could be what 99% of people in the Western world would call a loser, right? You could be all these things, but at least you're not someone who has just found out their girlfriend has cheated on them on Jerry Springer, right? At least you're not being publicly humiliated on television, right? There's always someone lower than you. And that show was a reminder of that. It was where people could yes, they could look at these rare vistas, but they could also feel better about themselves. The crowds, whether they're in the audience physically or watching at home, when they watch these people, they go, God, I'm better than these people. Right, I'm more classy than these people. I would never act that way. Now, and so it's sadistic in a way, right? It's sadistic, but it's also desperate, right? People loved watching these shows, despite the fact they were sadistic, because they couldn't look away, and it made them feel better about themselves, right? That's the Springer effect. That's why people watched these shows. And if you think about it, all of these four examples, the internet and the platforms on them are, in a way, kind of a modern-day Jerry Springer show. Whether it's YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, there are pockets of sophistication on these platforms, don't get me wrong. But there are also a lot of places, a lot of people on them, who are kind of like Jerry Springer, but online. We even have a term for these people, lolcows, right? People who people follow to sadistically watch them to feel better about themselves and because they can't look away. Now, I'm not saying these people are lolcows, but the logic is the same. The reason why people are drawn to these events is because they're rare, obscene, strange, and bizarre, right? But it's not just that might be why they get attention in the first place, but it's also that people like to look down on them. People like to feel better about themselves by comparing themselves to these people. So the Cash Me Outside girl, they'd say, I'd never speak to people like that. That MF is not real woman. I'd never have a mental breakdown in public like that. How embarrassing. The N-word woman, I'd never be so grotesque and so obscene or so rude. the Hawk Tuah girl, how unclassy, how filthy, I would never talk like that, right? It's not just the rarity, the obscenity, the oddity that draws people to these stories, to these people. It's the fact that people can't stop talking about them, right, in a negative way, feeling superior to them to feel better about themselves. So it's almost like a combination of fame and infamy, in a way. The Springer effect is amplified with these characters on the internet. It's the exact same psychology as the Jerry Springer show. So that's quite interesting. But the next reason, number 3, idiocracy, right? And this is a big one. So all human intelligence is determined by just 2 factors: genetics and education. And we're going to start off by talking about genetics. So parents are the most likely indicator of inherited IQ. And parents it's not just inherited IQ, it's inherited everything: hair colour, eye colour, facial features. Of course, your parents are the closest genetic link to you. They are the person who is statistically more likely, you're more likely to inherit traits from them, obviously. So, for example, if you had a father that had a 122 IQ and a mother that was 128 IQ, it's probably likely that their offspring will be within the range of 120 to 130 IQ, right? Not exactly difficult to figure that one out. Or alternatively, if a man's 88 IQ, the woman is 82 IQ, their offspring is probably going to inherit around 80 to 90 IQ, right? That's inherited IQ. Most intelligence is inherited, okay? Now, but however, parents don't always tell the full story. I mean, for example, let's take the 88 IQ man and the 82 IQ woman. It is possible for their offspring to have 110 IQ, right? Well, how does that work? Well, it works because of recessive genes. You hold genes, and everyone holds genes that are not necessarily active in them, but they're held on from possibly your parents, but also your grandparents, right? So, for example, here, the grandparents of the offspring, one of them could have had 115 IQ, the other 85. The 85's discarded. One of them could have had 110, another 180. The 80's discarded. The parents inherited the low IQ from the grandparents, but they hold on to the high IQ recessive gene, and so the third generation, this is statistically unlikely, but has inherited the high intelligence from the smarter grandparents. Again, statistically unlikely, but this is possible, and this is why I'm sure people whose parents are so stupid, but yet they're very intelligent, or people who are very stupid, but their parents are really intelligent. Again, it's not just this; it's also hair color, eye color, right? I mean, there are some people who both their parents are blonde, and yet their offspring's ginger, right? And how does that work? Has the mother cheated or the father cheated? No, it's because the grandparents may have had ginger hair, or the great grandparents might have had ginger hair. And they've held the recessive gene even if it's not active in them, right? And the same is true with eye colour and whatnot as well. But typically speaking, your parents are the more likely inheritor of inherited IQ, right? You are more likely to get the active dominant genes in your parents than the recessive genes that they're holding. Obviously, I mean that's just. Biology students will get angry at me for explaining this in this way, but roughly speaking, that is how it works. And so the bottom line is though it's not always the case, the chances are you will inherit your IQ, your intelligence, from your parents, right? And genetics factually play a core role in determining intelligence, even if it is unfair to us as individuals, right? So, for example, it's unfair that some people have parents and thus have inherited their parents' IQ that's very high, whereas other people have inherited IQs that are very low. This is obviously unfair. And we don't like this in the Western world because we're very individualistic. We view the world as a matter of we're all on an equal playing field, and the only thing that matters is is how hard you work. But the reality of the situation is that's a fantasy. That's not true. As much as we want to believe it would be true, and perhaps the world would be better if it was true in some ways, it isn't true. Some people really do get a bad hand in the intelligence department, and some people get a better hand. And this is true physically as well. Some people are born with certain physical deformities or diseases or some sorts of problems that are obviously unfair to them, but it doesn't change the fact that it does happen, unfortunately. The same is true for intelligence as well. It's not something that we want to think about, it's not something that we want to be the case, but it factually is the case. Right, and so throughout most of human history, however, people with higher intelligence typically had more offspring than people with lower intelligence, right? And so, for example, someone with a couple with their IQ in the 120s, they may have 4 offspring, whereas a couple with the IQ in the 80s may only have 2. Now, why is that the case? Well, it's not so much that people it's more the fact that people who have higher intelligence typically fare better in life, especially in the economy, right? They can use their intelligence to do things, to provide products and services to society that people with lower intelligence simply cannot provide because they probably wouldn't even come up with the idea, right? So people with higher intelligences typically tend to be more wealthy than people with lower intelligence. Now, that's not to say that if someone has high intelligence, they're guaranteed to be rich, and if someone has low intelligence, they're guaranteed to be poor. There are, of course, rich people who are really stupid, and there are, of course, poor people who are really smart. But typically speaking, people who are rich but low intelligence typically don't tend to hold on to that wealth for very long. They tend to lose it. Whereas people who are poor but smart, they don't tend to stay poor. They tend to gain wealth over time. So these things equal out. The bottom line however, is that people with higher intelligence tend to be richer in the long run, societally speaking, collectively speaking. People who have lower intelligence tend to be poorer, collectively speaking. And so in the past, when things like infant mortality was a big deal, there was no hospitals where women would give birth, and a lot of young people would die from diseases very early on. The medical industry was nowhere near as advanced as it was back then. People who were richer with higher resources, who could afford midwives were rare back in the past. That's another thing that people don't think about. But they could afford better medical care, better living conditions, treating diseases better. People who were poor couldn't do that, and so their children would die. Right, their children would not survive, much less so than the people with higher intelligence. It's not just that; it was also in things like wars. Right, people who were of a lower intelligence would die in wars, and people did die in wars much more in the past than they did in the present. Right, because they weren't thinking on the fly. They weren't thinking sharply as much as the others as the more intelligent people who might be better at fighting, better tacticians, have better weaponry, right? The overall point, however, is that in the past, as people with lower intelligence were much more likely to die. People with higher intelligence were much more likely to survive. Life was a lot rougher. And what this meant over time is that every generation, simply through natural selection, would increase in IQ. Because if IQ is mostly inherited, and people who are intelligent are typically having more children that survive and have more resources so they can have more children, right? Well, of course, the average intelligence as time goes by is going to increase and increase and increase, and that's exactly what happened. If you're watching this, by the way, I'm talking about your ancestors. In order for you to be alive today after hundreds of years, thousands of years of wars and famines and diseases, your ancestors were very crafty. They might not have necessarily been wealthy, but they were definitely intelligent. In order for you to be here, there's no other way that you could be here if your ancestors were the bottom of the barrel, right? Their bloodlines would have ended. The fact you're still alive means that your ancestors were part of this process of natural selection and increasing intelligence. They are survivors, right? But today, in the modern world, this trend is actually reversed, right? Whereby people with higher intelligence typically have less offspring than people with lower intelligence. And the reason for this is because society is much more safer today. Infant mortality is not that much of a problem. Everyone can give birth in a hospital within reason. Everyone can have a midwife within reason. Diseases, famines, these are things that they do happen still, but it's not things that we typically think about in the Western world. We have a lot of food. We have a lot of assistance for people. But more so than that, men and women now both work, right? And so when a man and woman works, it is not in the interests of that couple, especially the woman, to have children, because having children will interfere with their career. as opposed to men who can just carry on, going up the corporate ladder. And so it's actually become an economic deficiency for people to have children, and therefore the disincentives to not have children are there. And so wealthy people, for example, or not wealthy people, intelligent people, for example, this is going to sound terrible, but they would have abortions or they would use contraception because the society is set up in such an individualistic way that it has become a disincentive to have children. It will affect you financially negatively to have children. In the past, children used to work a lot as well. That's something that not a lot of people think about. Meanwhile, for people with lower intelligence, there is no consequences for them having children, constantly, even if they can't afford them, because you have welfare schemes that subsidize reproduction. In fact, it's actually people who are incentivized in some ways to have children if they're on welfare because they'll get more money for having children. So there's economic disincentives for intelligent people who both work and are both highly skilled, because typically, remember, people who are more intelligent are going to be more highly skilled, to have children, so they'll have less children. They might have one, right, or sometimes zero. Whereas people who are on welfare, again, people who are typically no skilled or low skilled, and these things are all independent of from one another, but they are incentivized to have more children. And so the trend is reversed. With every generation that goes by now, the IQ does not increase, it decreases. The most intelligent people, the most skilled people in Western society are having less children than they were in generations past, whereas the people who aren't are having more, right? So we have a decrease in IQ now. To be clear, however, it should be noted that it's less so true that truly high intelligence people have less offspring, but more so true of those of middling intelligence. That's something that's really important, and Elon Musk is oddly a good example of this. So, for example, you can see this chart here. People who have 80 IQ and have a lot of children, they'll be like, me like booby, right? They don't think about contraception. They don't plan things out for the long term. They just have intercourse and don't think about the consequences. And then the welfare state steps in and goes, okay, well, we'll look after you. People in middling intelligence, however, will be like, no, this will ruin my career. I'll lose my job in, writing Microsoft Excel spreadsheets if, I have a child. So I can't do that. We're not going to have any. We're going to have contraception or abortion or whatever, right? But people who have high IQ, and I mean really high IQ, will typically gain a lot more money. And so having children is not necessarily a loss to them anyway, because they can hire assistants like nannies to look after their offspring regardless, because they're so high up the corporate ladder. They excel above the average person. But they'll also have the intelligence to want to look at society from outside their own individual circumstances and view the collective health of civilization, where they'll conclude, perhaps having offspring is a moral obligation because the intelligence is decreasing with each generation, because we have a big population crisis coming up where people are not having enough children, right? So it's not. I want to clarify this. Intelligence is going down, okay, because people with low intelligence are having a lot of children, and people in the middling of intelligence are having almost none. But people on the high end of intelligence are still having nowhere near as many children as the poor people, but still more than the people in the middle, because they have the it's not as much of a big deal to them economically. And again, they're going to conclude the collective over the individual. They're going to see the bigger problem here, right? So either way, however, the result is still a decreasing IQ with each generation that goes by. Right, so the overall end result is exactly what I just said, a clear and noticeable decrease in average IQ with each generation that passes. So, for example, numerous news sources here. CNN, IQ scores are falling and have been for decades. And New York Post, study suggests IQ scores in the US have fallen. Forbes, technology is on the rise while IQ is on the decline. Right, this is something that sociologists have noticed. Right, people have noticed that intelligence from, say, the millennials compared to Generation Z and Generation Z compared to Generation Alpha, there's a noticeable average intelligence decline in these, and that is very dramatic. Numerous points per generation, where people are getting dumber and dumber and dumber because they're inheriting worse genes in the median than what was the case 100, 200 years ago, where typically people with higher intelligence and higher resources had more offspring than those with lower intelligence and less resources, right? Makes sense. But, genetics isn't the only part of human intelligence. Of course, you also have education. And unfortunately, education is a disaster as well. Because even if someone wins the genetic lottery, right, and has inherited high intelligence, so your parents are smart, you're smart, the modern education system likely won't put such intelligence to good use anyway, right? So even if you've inherited a good amount of IQ, if the society doesn't inspire you or use that in some way, it's not going to be effective. And the education system today does not do that. And a big reason for that is PlayStation 5? What's this got to do with PlayStation? I thought we were talking about education. Actually, it has quite a lot to do with it. So, this is a screenshot here of a video game called God of War, right? And I want you to look at this screenshot. Even if you're not into games, it doesn't matter. Look at that screenshot. Doesn't that look impressive? Right? Like, doesn't that picture look like really like, wow, that looks like photorealistic and interesting and, that it's mind-blowing that humans are capable of generating graphics that look that advanced, right? Well, that's the realities at home for a lot of young people today, right? A lot of young people, they have these game consoles, and again, I've used a PlayStation 5 as an example because it's very affordable. A lot of people have one, millions of people have one. This isn't like high-end technology we're talking about here. This is basic consumer technology that young people use, that their parents buy them. This is what people have at home now. Like, it's quite mind-blowing when you zoom out and look at how much human technology has advanced, but this is not mind-blowing graphics, really. Like, this is like standard, right? Like, this is the realities that young people have at home. They can play video games very easily and very affordably that look like that have these worlds that are very immersive. Again, it's not just about graphics, it's also about immersion. They can immerse themselves in these worlds. They can get lost in these worlds. Like, to a young person, playing video games like this is incredibly, mind-blowing. It's amazing. But the realities at school is that they're still using pen and paper, right? So you have young people who go home and play a PlayStation 5, playing these games that are mind-blowing, look mind-blowing, have these advanced storylines, and their minds are captured by them. Meanwhile, they go to school and it's like, you've got to do algebra on the paper, right? I mean, with all due respect, how do you expect young people to, why do we have a home environment that is in the 2020s, but an educational environment that is stuck in the 20th century, in the 1990s? You can't possibly expect young people to care about learning and education when it's presented to them in a substantially more boring way than what they're used to being entertained by, right? And again, I feel like people who are under the age of 30 will understand what I mean by this, because you've probably grown up with video games, especially if you're male. But school is incredibly boring, a lot more boring than it would have been to people growing up, say, after World War II, where there wasn't that much to do at home anyway. There wasn't, if you were young, the toys were nowhere near as interesting as they are now, right? And so the point I'm trying to make here is that when we have things that are so mind-blowing and so entertaining, it is so much more difficult for young people to focus on pen and paper education when all they're thinking about is what they're going to do when they get home on the PlayStation. The PlayStation isn't the problem, right? I'm not complaining about gaming here. I'm complaining about that education has not caught up to the basic realities of what young people experience at home in terms of entertainment. So really, what could fix this is what I call the gamification of education, and this would have fantastic results. For example, I remember when I was in primary school, we had this computer lab. It wasn't quite as flashy as that one I've got on the picture there. We used to have these big CRT monitors, which some people might remember. But we had them, and then we had this application called Education City, right? And Education City was like you could learn English, math, science. You can see it there, and it was like you played games to learn. Right? And when I say played games, I don't mean like it was silly. I don't mean like people were playing Call of Duty on Education City. I mean, It gamified education. It made education fun. It wasn't just doing lines or doing algebra or doing boring sums on pen and paper. It had points, it had medals, it had grades, things that young people, the things that game developers use to incentivize their players to play their games. It took those same principles and applied them to education. And people used to love it. The fact that I still remember the name Education City, despite the fact that I've not been in primary school for almost 2 decades, should prove how effective it was. Right? And so until the realities at home match the realities at school, then how can young people possibly care about education and learning? They just simply aren't going to. When you have these capabilities of entertainment that are so vastly more interesting than pen and paper, people aren't going to learn. Education has to be gamified, right? Education has to stop pretending that it's the 1990s and earlier and catch up to the realities of the possibilities that young people have at their disposal for entertainment. If it doesn't do this, then young people will never care about education. They will never pay attention to it, and they will grow up thinking that education and learning is a burden, and the only thing they'll care about is entertainment and playing games, or watching movies, or browsing social media. That's all they'll care about. Their passions, their skills, the things that they will, in adulthood, add to society, will never come into fruition unless education catches up in that regard. So, these are the two things. All human intelligence is determined by 2 factors, genetics and intelligence, and in both regards, things aren't going well for different reasons. And, we have a little bit of a movie about this called Idiocracy. I don't want to go into it too much because I think it's oversighted, but the movie is essentially this plot line. It's that, people with less intelligence are having more offspring, people with high intelligence are not having enough. So that's the genetic element, but then society kind of just collapses and becomes a joke and nothing really functions anymore. And that is kind of where that is where we're going at the moment. And there was a show. It's a fact that people with lower intelligence find simpler vistas more comedic, right? So there was this show in the UK called You've Been Framed. And You've Been Framed was a show where it was literally just people falling over. Like, you would have home movies and people would film their family. And, like, someone would be on a beach and then they would fall over a sandcastle and fall headfirst into the sand. And then people would submit that video to You've Been Framed, and then it would be part of, like, 100 of those clips back to back to back where people would fall over, there'd be a sound effect, and then there would be a laugh track, and then the commentator would say some witty remark about someone falling over, and it would just be the same thing over and over and over again. And what's interesting with You've Been Framed is that it was very popular with young people because young people are more easily entertained and find things more funny. I mean, for example, if you have a younger brother or a sister or a cousin or whatever, and you make a fart noise like, they find it the most hilarious thing in the world. Whereas if you do that to someone in their 20s or 30s, they're just going to look at you like, you've got something wrong with you, right? And You've Been Framed was like that. Like, you could tell. You've Been Framed was like a subtle intelligence test, because young people who obviously weren't that intelligent because they're still developing, they thought it was hilarious. But also adults who weren't very smart would also find it the funniest thing in the world, whereas people who were intelligent need a little bit more sophistication than people falling over. Like, it gets a bit old, right? But, shows like this and vistas like this get more popular if the average intelligence is lower, right? And so, again, brings us back to the 4 horsewomen. What kind of people do you think... Let's put this in this way. What kind of people do you think found these stories originally and shared them originally and made them spread and get popular originally? Because obviously people with lower intelligence. Because if you're someone with high intelligence or even medium intelligence, and you saw the Cash Me Outside girl, you're not like speaking to the audience in that regard. You're not going to find that very interesting. Same thing, or the Hawk Tuah girl, right? Her talking about spitting on male genitalia. Again, you're not going to find that amusing. human beings are communal creatures. We like to share things to people if we think they'll like them, because if then we make them happier and then they'll like us more, right? But so if you're of high intelligence and you have high intelligent company, you're not going to share any of these stories, because the people you share them to wouldn't find them funny. They wouldn't get it. In fact, they'd probably find them disgusting. But if you're of a lower intelligence, the people, and your company is assumedly also lower intelligence, if you share these stories to them, they will find it very funny, right? And so there's an incentive for people with low intelligence to share things that are very, primitive in terms of comedy, right? I'm sounding very holier than thou, but I don't mean it in that way. I mean it. I just saying it how it is. Things that are very primitive in terms of comedy, people with lower intelligence are more likely to share that because they have they know a lot of people who would also want to see it. That's how these things become big in the first place, right? And so as society declines because of a combination of genes and education in terms of idiocracy, then of course the things that the culture talks about in the status quo are going to be of a more dumber and dumber theme, because there's more dumb people, right? And so there was a tweet I saw, and I don't know who made this tweet. The name's I don't know who it is, but I think it's an amazing tweet. A lot of online annoyance just comes from autists and normies being forced to use the same internet. Normies just like talking about genitalia, celebrities, pubic hair 24/7. It's like if orangutans were allowed on the internet and just kept spamming about bananas on every website. Again, that is such a good tweet. Exactly, but it's not so much about autists and normies. It's simply the fact that people with lower intelligence are increasing in population. Again, because of the reasons we've just cited, and they will find sort of primitive things like a woman talking about spitting on male genitalia funny, right? And they're more likely to share it. Because they're more likely to share it, it's more likely to get fame and infamy through the Springer effect as well. That's another thing. A lot of people with middle and high intelligence, they look at things like the Hawk Tuah girl, and they go like, this has to be a psyop. Right, this has to be artificially promoted. There's no way that so many people find this funny, but it's not. It's not a psyop. There are. I think you're simply underestimating your own intelligence. There are an increasing amount of people who are so stupid that they would find that funny. Like, oh, Hawk Tuah, it's like the sound that you make when you spit. Like this. There are people who find that funny. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. And that's why these things come to prominence in the first place, right? Which brings us on to the last reason, number 4, normalization of openness. And I think that this reason is actually, as I said, much more bigger than the Springer effect, and perhaps even more bigger than Idiocracy. Right, so I was talking to someone a few weeks ago, and we were having I don't know this guy, I'm not friends with him, he's just someone who I come across occasionally. You won't see this, thank God. And we were talking about economics. We were talking about stocks or something like that, right? And when you're talking about economics, you talk about many. The conversation can easily spread to other things, and the topic of accountants came up. And this guy who I was talking to said to me, just completely out of the blue, like we were only talking about economic topics, and then out of the blue he just tells me, oh man, my sister's friend is an accountant, right? And she has the biggest tits. And I just want to rub my face all over her tits. And I was like, it was so unexpected. I was so taken aback. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't offended by it. I wasn't like prudent or like, you disgust me. But it was just so surprising to me because I don't know this guy. Like, this guy isn't like a friend of mine. I speak to him every so often. Occasionally, like, you run into him, that kind of thing. And, it was so weird to just have a serious conversation, very mature conversation, and then he just comes out of the blue with a fantasy of his with a woman who isn't even present. Like, what? And I was thinking, why? Okay, well, why are you telling me this? Right? It was just one of those awkward moments where I was like speechless almost. It's one of the. I know me explaining this, it might sound strange, but if you were there, you'd know what I mean. It was so out of the blue. It was so unexpected. And he I've noticed that younger men, which are about 18 to 35, let's say, tend to be noticeably more open about their lewd desires than older men who are like 35 plus. There seems to be some sort of phenomenon amongst younger people, younger men specifically, where people just don't have a filter. They don't recognize, for example, that their desires with women, what they want to do with women in bed, is typically something that's reserved for, like, you're meant to keep that between you and the woman. It's a private matter. It's something that people haven't historically discussed these things openly, right? They don't just talk about, especially in such depth as well. Like I've seen Discord servers, for example, where groups of guys will have a channel where they'll just post pictures of like half-naked women in bikinis and talk about what the specific parts of their body they like and what they want to do and all this stuff. And I think, like, why are you doing this? I can understand the desires. I'm not complaining that gentlemen have desires. This is why the human race, carries on existing. But why are you talking about this openly in a group setting? Why do you not have a filter? Why do you not recognise that these desires, these things, are private matters? They're meant to be between you and your partner. The world doesn't need to know about what you got up to last night in the bedroom. Do you know what I mean? But younger men are way, way more open about these things than older men. And, it's a fact that people generally assume that their childhood was normal and base how they act on such later on, right? So, for example, if you grew up with no father, your dad was a deadbeat, and you're a guy, it's very likely you yourself, when you impregnate a woman, will be a deadbeat to your offspring, because that's what you're used to. It's not guaranteed, but statistically it's much more likely. Likewise, if you're a woman, you were raised by a single mother, you're going to think you're going to end up probably statistically being a single mother yourself. If you grew up with a house where there was alcohol, right, and cigarettes, the chances are you as well will consume alcohol and cigarettes because it's always been around you. It's considered normal. Whereas if you were like a Muslim, let's say, you're not going to drink, you're not going to smoke, right? Because these things are not normal to you. They're considered sinful on a subconscious level. Even if you weren't a Muslim anymore, you probably still wouldn't drink or smoke. Houses that are more sporty, their parents are more sporty, obviously more likely to play sports. Houses that are more intellectual, bookworms, more likely to read books. It's not rocket science, right? What you grew up with, you consider to be normal, and in adulthood, you manifest this behaviour with your own offspring. Of course, there are exceptions like trauma, for example, or whatnot, but typically speaking, what happens in your childhood is considered normal, and you manifest that. So here's the question then. Why are younger men between the ages of, let's say, 18 to 35 more noticeably open about their lewd desires than older men? What's changed with the childhoods of younger men, that what older men didn't experience, to make this sort of openness about lewd desires and what's going on there? And the reason, of course, is the increased accessibility and availability of adult material via the internet. And look, I'm not going to go on a tangent about why watching adult material on the internet is bad for you, because I've made an entire production on that called Don't Be a Coomer. But this is the reason why. And, I want to explain this, however, in a different way than what most people would. See, in the pre-internet era, adult material, women in bikinis, men and women having intercourse, it existed. But it existed in magazine form or VHS form, right? Like physical media. And so people, if you wanted to buy or consume adult material when you were an adult, you would have to go to like one of these seedy stores that existed in like before the 90s, before the internet, where people would sell these magazines and VHS tapes, right? But here's the thing. Who's going to do that? Like 90% of men have the dignity, like they have the shame not to walk into a store like that, walk around looking around at what they're into, having to go up to a guy behind a counter, show them what they're into and pay for it face to face. Like 90% of people aren't going to do that, right? Not only that though, but even the 10% of people who were shameless and did do these things, even after the fact, they still, because the media was physical, it was a burden to them. I mean, imagine if you bought an adult material magazine or VHS tape, right? Well, then you're stuck with it. Even after you've done your business with it, you're still stuck with it. And if you were a man who lived with their parents, for example, or if you were, say, I don't know, maybe you had a wife or a girlfriend, you can't just leave that stuff hanging around. It's a burden. It's a threat, and people would really judge you for that because they would think you were a freak for owning it, right? And so do you know what people used to do with magazines and VHS tapes of adult material? Do you know what they used to do? I'm not joking. They would go into a forest, right? A forest, and dig a hole and bury it. I'm not joking with you. You're going to think I'm making this up. People would bury like magazines of women in bikinis and like men and women having intercourse, physical media. They couldn't keep it around their house if they lived with other people. That would be too embarrassing if someone found it. So they went into a forest, picked a specific spot, dug a hole, and buried it in there. And then when they wanted to use it again, they would go back to the hole, dig it up again, and take it back. I swear this is what people used to do before the internet. And again, it sounds funny, it sounds ridiculous, it sounds absurd, but that was the world back then. There was no internet, right? Adult material wasn't easily accessible. You had to get it through these disgusting, humiliating means, and then people, it wasn't as accessible back then. Now, this isn't the case at all in the post-internet era. There are no dodgy stores. You don't have to do that. You just going in a forest and digging a hole, people just delete their history. The point is that adult material, if people want to watch naked ladies, men and women having intercourse, they can do that on their phones, their tablets, their computers in seconds with relative ease for no cost, no humiliation aspect of people judging them. The accessibility and the availability is much higher. In fact, even if you're someone who doesn't want to watch adult material, you'll still come across it. If you're browsing Twitter, for example, you'll see these women in bikinis and whatnot. Even if you're not looking for them, the algorithm will recommend it to you. You can't avoid it. And I believe that in the post-internet era, the reason why younger men tend to be more noticeably open about their lewd desires is because they grew up in an environment where such desires were absolutely everywhere. Adult material was so accessible, so available, people spoke about these things so openly that they've got it into their head that it's normal. It's normal to be open about discussing what you want to do with women, the kinds of things that they're into and whatnot. It's just completely normal to them. When it isn't normal, this is not something that has been normal in the past. It's not healthy behavior. These desires are things that should be kept privately between people's partners, not something that they should discuss and broadcast openly to the world and talk about in gruesome and specific detail. It's incredibly unhealthy. And again, how does this link, for example, I know you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with the topic at hand? How does this link into these 4 examples? Well, what do you notice about all 4 of these examples? They're all women. They're all young. And every single one of these examples has some sort of lewd aspect to them. For example, the Cash Me Outside girl. Did you know that the week she turned 18 years old, she started an OnlyFans account? And within that first week, I think she earned over $1 million. So when she was on the Dr. Phil show, she was young. But that implies that there's been predatory men, who have followed her from her viral moment for years, and then join OnlyFans for that purpose. Isn't that disgusting? Do you not think that's a bit strange? That's a bit odd. What about that MF is not real woman? When people first came across this clip, one of the first things they did was deepfake video, or not deepfake, but Photoshop pictures of her in a bikini and in like Princess Leia clothes and things like that. You had men slobbering over her, saying like, "Oh, I've got to find out who this woman is. I've got to, like, what's her name? Will she date me?" Of course, there's a sexual element involved in that equation. Do you think if it was a man that people would have been doing that? Do you think people would have responded in that way? Of course they wouldn't. What about the N-word woman? Why do you think that so many men, specifically conservative men, supposedly conservative men, jumped to defend her, jumped to interview her? because they're a conventionally attractive woman. But do you think if they weren't, do you think if they were an obese woman with glasses and spots and greasy hair and, like, do you think people would have defended her as much? Do you think people would be hailing her as a free speech warrior and all this stuff? Of course they wouldn't. Of course they wouldn't. If you think that, there's something wrong with you. And the Hawk Tuah girl, the entire reason that she's known is because she speaks about genitalia, right? And what women do to them. The entire reason is sexual. You can't even remove that element from them. So in all these, the point I'm trying to make is that the reasons why all these people became, like, their viral moment was not based in lewdness, but the survival of the fame, and in some cases the wealth, originates from this undertone of a large group of young men not being able to have a filter on lewdness, on their own desires, and they project these desires in a desperate form onto any woman who comes into the equation, which in this case are these women, right? And so and to me that seems so obvious, but I feel like the vast majority of people will not have a clue what I'm talking about when I talk about this. I've tried to explain this to some people, and they look at me like, I don't get the connection. I don't see what you're talking about here. But to me, it seems obvious. Imagine if these were men. Do you really think that they would have as much attention, have as much fame, have as much money? Of course they wouldn't. There's an underlying societal problem that young men have with being too desperate and too open about their lewd desires, and it's not, and the consequences of that are unusual, in some cases predatory. But in all cases, extremely negative for everyone involved, right? I really hope people understand what I mean by that, because again, I feel like most people will not have a clue, not be able to make the connection. But hopefully, you know what I mean. Like, until this openness of lewdness and this desperation ceases, like, we're just going to keep getting this, and it's always going to be women, and it's not the women who are necessarily the problem at hand here, because in many ways it's accidental. It's the men, these legions of lonely, desperate guys who just cannot stop. They act like animals, they behave like animals, and they can't help themselves when they come across even the most mundane of vistas. They attach on to women. Sounds like a very progressive and feminist argument, but it's, a broken clock is right twice a day, I suppose. Right, so number 5, this brings us on to number 5, natural selection. How is this going to end, right? Will this situation ever stop? Is America always going to make stupid people famous, or are we ever going to get to the end of this? Well, look, the continued proliferation of the three reasons mentioned today is the total acceptance of a radical individualist incentive structure, right? So, like the Springer effect, for example. Why, as we've said, people love to watch these shows because it makes them feel better about themselves. It makes people feel holier than thou. Right, intelligent people are not having enough children, and the education system isn't being fixed, because the incentives don't yet exist to fix these problems economically. Right, it makes sense for intelligent people not to have children. So again, it's putting the individual interest above the collective interest. And again, the problem with the normalization of openness is that society has sort of mutually agreed that it's, for some reason, that it's completely fine that young men get blasted with adult material and grow up to become perverts who can't control themselves and their own bodies and their own minds, and latch on to women fanatically in the most pathetic and just humiliating ways, because that's freedom, right? People think, people should be allowed to watch adult material if they so desire. Even if the reality is actually drastically terrible consequences for society at large, both men and women. It's all about individualism. The United States especially suffers for this because America was set up to be as individualistic as possible, which, has its upsides, but it also has its many downsides, and these are the downsides. But these can all be reversed if society replaces such with a collectivistic incentive structure, likely through strong social reforms like China. It's so funny how people make out that China is this dystopian, terrible country where no one would want to live there and it's awful. And in many ways, I can understand why. Of course, I can. But in many ways, China has got a lot of things figured out that the West hasn't. The Jerry Springer show would never be a thing in China. The Chinese government wouldn't want people being entertained by the misery of other people in that way. They would find such displays to be something that needs to be sorted out through government reforms in some regard. And they wouldn't like that kind of sadistic form of entertainment being aired because it would make China look bad from the outside in, right? It would be humiliating to the fabric of the moral of the nation, if that makes sense. Same thing with Idiocracy. China has no problem. Countries like China, they have no problem drastically ripping up like what is considered normal. Like they have no problem providing these incentive structures for people to reproduce, to have families. Like they don't care. Like they don't care about the individual desire. They say, look, you have to do what the collective, what is right for the collective, for the greater good. Like the society is more important than you as an individual, right? Even if things are going well for you as an individual, if the collective society that you're a part of collapses, then you will have no individual prosperity at all. And they have no problem cracking down on things and trying to socially engineer society, often to no effect, to meet that end. Same thing with adult material. Countries like China, they ban adult material. And same thing with Singapore as well. These authoritarian Asian countries, they don't allow their young men to become corrupted by perverse fantasies and desires. They don't allow it. They just simply say no. And the consequences of that have been rather positive. That you don't have the same slobbering barbarians in adulthood that you do in America and Europe, let's say. It just doesn't happen. The men don't become perverted. Prosperity and morality is viewed as more important as freedom and accessibility in these countries. That's what I mean by a collectivistic incentive structure. Like the individual comes second to the collective when things matter. Right, and if that doesn't happen in the Western world, which I don't think it will, and I especially don't think it will in the United States, then all these problems will just continue to get worse. However, actually, before I go into that, by the way, like the Chinese example, imagine all these examples in China, like the Cash Me Outside girl, that MF is not real woman, the N-word woman, Hawk Tuah girl, they wouldn't have happened in a country like China. In China, their social media prioritizes healthy things, healthy eating, education, smart things, economics, for example. Meanwhile, the American version is like people shaking their bums and like throwing up and drinking. Why do you think that is? Why is it that the Chinese don't allow such clips to go viral or to spread? Because they're socially engineering their society in a collectivistic manner, even if that means quenching the individual. There is no Chinese four horsewomen. China does not make stupid people, or more accurately, people doing stupid things famous. It doesn't happen. But again, if the Western world doesn't want to go down that route, and I don't think it will, well, that's fine. Because if not, however, it may seem as if natural selection has failed, but it has not, it never does, and will merely be playing the long game. If the West doesn't want to concede some individuality, this fanatical individualism, for a little bit of collectivism, telling the individuals, no, you can't do that. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do this for a good reason, for the greater good. And I know that's a dodgy road to go down. But if the West isn't willing to do that, everything I've mentioned today will get worse. There will be more Springer. The Springer effect will get way worse. Idiocracy will just carry on. Like IQs will keep decreasing. Education will not be fixed. The normalization of openness will get worse. You'll have people walking around who can't, never mind being open about their lewd desires, it'll be all they talk about. On every street corner, there'll be some guy twerking, right? This is true, that this dystopia, this reality will just reach its maximum endgame conclusion, which is just awful. But from that, society will create a free market desire, like an ideological free market, where where in such a decadent and dystopian society, acting moral and upright will actually become cool. It will become cool to be religious. It will become cool to get married and to not have abortions and to not, to plan your life, to be sensible, right? It will essentially, society will just get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse without forced social engineering of a collectivistic nature. But then from that, from it getting so bad, when everything has just become completely chaotic, it will eventually get better, right? But in order to get better, it has to get much, much worse. We have to reach the end game, the absolute worst scenario that you can imagine, in order for that to happen. And I think that's what's going to happen with the Western world. It's possible. We could get some very authoritarian governments who try to socially engineer society and to make it better, which many of those social engineering attempts can easily backfire, by the way, because a lot of people don't know what they're doing in that regard. It's possible we could get that, but I think it's much more possible that Western society will just, as dramatic as this sounds, will just get worse and worse and worse throughout the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, and eventually, near the end of the 21st century, it'll get so bad that it will start to reverse, right, by simple market forces, if you would, of ideas. I think that's sadly a lot more likely. Either way, I hope this has explained why America keeps making stupid people famous and why it will probably continue. The Springer effect, people like to feel better and they're drawn to oddities. Idiocracy, people are getting dumber, they're more easily amused and more likely to share stupid things. And the normalization of openness, young men are exposed to perverseness and they think that's normal later on in life, and therefore they latch on to women, particularly online, in an unhealthy manner. All right, so thank you very much. Thanks for watching this lecture. Comment below, what are your thoughts on why America keeps making stupid people famous? I'd be curious about your thoughts on this. Find me on X/Twitter. I'm always going to call it Twitter, I think. And thank you very much to the patrons on the Wall of Fame. You have no idea how charmed I am, especially to the new patrons there. It's so charming that you would choose to support this. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this. And yeah, see you next time.